Thank you. And thank you, Peter, for providing all that great background so that I don't have to. I just knocked the balance off. How do I do that? Okay. All right. I don't know. Oh, got it. Okay. Okay. So, what I want to use my time on then is to actually talk about the pulse flow. And um, before I say that, I also just want to say, Peter just took you through all of that background, and I got to talk about the fun part. I want to point out that getting to the fun part took us a long time, and I think one of our keys to success was I think I met Peter and Osval and a handful of other people more than 15 years ago working on this issue, and we've stuck through it. And it wasn't always the fun part. In fact, for most of the time we've been working on it, it has not been the fun part. So when you're sort of laboring away on what feels like your Sisyphean efforts to push, grains of sand up a pyramid or whatever it feels like, um, you just, I don't know. I don't know how to um, give you words of inspiration or, stick with it because persistence, I honestly think most people, my mother raised a stubborn girl. Persistence, I think, is a lot of how we got to where we are today. And so if you can find it in yourself and find it in a good team of people that you get to work with, stick with it. And sometimes those hard efforts stand off. All right. No, wait, I haven't even made a fool of myself yet. So I want to just talk to you about the pulse flow today. So why, first of all, what is this pulse flow and why a pulse flow? What we did to prepare for it, what it was like, what it looked like, if we can pull this off. We're even going to show you a couple little video clips. Just touch very briefly on the media coverage, which was not insignificant. This is a case where where in some ways the message is the medium. Also talk a little bit about the monitoring activities that we've set up, and then just briefly on next steps, although Peter really sort of laid out for you what our big picture next steps are already. So why a pulse flow? Well, here is, let's see if I get this right. Nope, not that one. The set with the middle. Here's the Colorado River coming down. This is Mexico over here and Arizona over here, and this is the most downstream dam on the river, Morelos Dam. And you can see that Mexico is pulling its treaty allocated water that it is ordering every year for its water users off the river here into a major canal. And there's a very, very small trickle of water moving down the channel there, really seepage from the dam combined with, at that point, a gaining reach where a little bit of groundwater is sitting in the bottom of the channel. So essentially a very, very desiccated river channel at this point. And some folks who actually Dr. Ed Glenn from University of Arizona, who started doing some field work down in this region in the 90s, was one of the first people to notice that there were some patches of native southwestern riparian habitat, that cottonwood and willow that we all love. And he started looking into it and realized that, notwithstanding the fact that there's this history of drying out this region because of the extent to which we've developed the Colorado River, that there had been some larger flows that had moved through, and that those had overbanked and created conditions where the native habitat would thrive. So he thought, well, if we can just make sure that that continues to happen, then that habitat will continue to thrive. So what we have to do is just protect those flows. That's kind of where we started with the idea of a pulse flow. Back in the late 90s, EDF published a report called The Delta Once More, where we actually worked with Dr. Glenn and published this idea of a pulse flow plus base flows, perennial flows, to keep everything alive when you weren't having a pulse flow. And then a few years later, we worked with Sonoran Institute and Pro Natura and World Wildlife Fund, a number of other organizations, to produce the Conservation Priorities Report. And what was significant about that, in addition to giving us the map that Peter already showed you, is that it allowed us to start communicating more clearly to water managers who were sort of trained to defend their allocations of the Colorado River. It allowed us to start talking about the Delta as a resource that really needed a very small amount of Colorado River water for precise areas that needed restoration. And they stopped hearing an environmental community saying, take down your dams. We don't like dams. We want a free running river. Maybe some people were still saying that, but it allowed us to move past that sort of old dialectic on the river into a more deliberate conversation about restoration. So at that time in the late 90s, we talked about a pulse flow. The estimate was really just based on anecdotal observations, was about 260,000 acre feet once every 4 or 5 years was enough to overbank, create conditions that were conducive to good riparian habitat restoration, plus a base flow, perennially flowing. We originally said about 30,000 acre feet. Later, Dr. Glenn upped it to about 50,000 acre feet. And in all, we said this, if you annualize the pulse flow, is about 1% of the historic annual average flow of the Colorado River. So again, bringing it down to such a modest request really helped change, at least allow us to have the conversation. I guess what really happened is we started getting invited to conferences to talk about this, as opposed to being sort of so laughably considered to have such a laughably crazy idea when people didn't understand it was such a small amount of water. I just wanted to put up here, so I've moved the 99 estimates over to the left of the slide and showing you here what was actually in the minute. So just so that you understand, we weren't dealing with, in the actual pulse flow, we weren't dealing with volumes of water that were prescribed or recommended in the science literature. Rather, it was a set of negotiated volumes. So we had about 105,000 acre feet for the pulse flow to be delivered once during the term of the 5-year minute, plus a commitment from the NGOs through the Delta Water Trust to deliver 50,000 acre feet total over 5 years. In other words, about 10,000 acre feet a year. So now still quite a reduced set of volumes from what was originally estimated for the need in this area. So the minute passed, late 2012, right? We have been working on this since the late 90s, 15 years, right? We're just used to kind of leaning into it and going and being in for the long haul. And all of a sudden it was like, warp speed, move ahead. You got to plan a pulse flow, and here's the volume. What are we going to do with it? So with now federal agencies and state agencies as our partners, a place we had never been in before, we set up an environmental flows team to figure out how to deliver these water volumes. And you can see here a host of agencies from the US and Mexico and nonprofits again at the table. And we then, that team realized that what we really needed were scientists and experts to help us with our questions. But we didn't have, this is the people who are sort of managing the process. These are the people, the organizations that had the scientists and experts to help give us information. And we had to make sure that we kept those boundaries somewhat legible to keep everybody comfortable with where we were going to go in this process. So we convened these folks for a series of 3 workshops over the summer of 2013. And we had to figure out, what are we going to do with this volume of water we're going to call a pulse flow? And there was nothing in the minute other than just said, here's your volume of water. We'd like to see it delivered earlier in the minute rather than later. We equally knew that we wanted to deliver it before the reservoirs got into a shortage condition, which might actually get in our way of being able to deliver. And then we had sort of the technical challenge of saying we have to operate within the, we have to deliver the pulse flow within the operational constraints of the system. There's dams here. We might want to use some of the irrigation system to move through. We had to kind of assess that. But we also, the big kind of hairy thing we had to deal with, Peter already identified for you, which was the dry reach. So essentially reach 3 but this is just reaches that are configured for us to be able to talk about different places in the Delta. But you can see um, right here, this big cone of depression creating about 25 miles of dry riverbed. And we knew that when the water hit the dry riverbed, what's going to happen? It's going to start to infiltrate. So how could we most effectively deliver water to the entire riparian corridor? And because of high groundwater, we know that our best sites for existing habitat and restoration are above, where the groundwater is high in Reach 1 and part of Reach 2, and then below, principally in what we call Reach 4, which is a site that Sonoran Institute and Pro Natura have already made significant investments in restoration, or continuing to, but we knew we needed to get groundwater or water, surface water, down to Reach 4, or that was our hope, to be able to promote additional restoration there. So we spent our workshops talking about the different elements of the hydrograph, and I'm not going to go into this chart, which I think most of you understand already anyway. It was designed by Eloise Kendi at the Nature Conservancy to help us talk about the different parts of the pulse flow. And someday, hopefully, we'll get our act together and publish a paper that tells you sort of what exactly was the hydrograph that we used. But the idea was to have a peak sufficiently high as to be able to carry water past that dry reach. We also, to the extent that the canal system was available to take some of our pulse flow water, bypassed the channel. But it ended up being a very little water, and it ended up essentially being some of the tail of the hydrograph that we could bypass because, surprise, surprise, we're trying to deliver water to grow native riparian vegetation at the peak of what you might call the growing season, when, guess what, all the irrigators are trying to maximize their deliveries to ensure that their plants are growing as well. And we essentially had junior priority in that system. We could send our water over, in the extra canal space that was available. So we were quite limited in what we could bypass. So the pulse flow. Here's the dam. There is the very first tongue of water of that pulse flow. I was there with maybe 100 other people standing down below the dam watching it first begin to pour over in late March of this year. It was a pretty exciting day. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what it looks like. So I think sometimes when I talk about this without the aid of visuals, people get the sense of this wall of water moving down the channel. So I'm going to show you, if we can play these videos, like 20-second video clips. See if we can get them to work. To get to the river, you often have to cross through a lot of scrub, tamarisk. It's not always easy. It's like somebody dredged something over here. Let's see. Kind of got to go bush crashing. Here we're walking into the dry channel. Whoops. Can we go? Yeah, that one. So now here I am in the channel. Looks like it's going at a pretty good pace. It is coming. Look at it go. You can see that water moving, creeping across the crust of the dry riverbed. And if you look a little upstream, it is rushing. It's on its way. So this is just about... So I've walked just about 30 feet upstream, and you can see there's really some rushing water here. Moving pretty fast. I think it's going to move down this channel pretty quickly. So there you have a sense, and it did take weeks for our 100,000 acre feet of water to extend through the 100 miles of riverbed of the Colorado River Delta. So very slow progress as it crossed that dry sands, and probably slower than even our expert and scientist group had anticipated, because there's so much sand to cover for it to cross. But eventually it did fill up the river channel. So here's just a picture from the air of what it looks like. So we got our overbanking. We're inundating not only the channel, but some of the terrace. So one of the things that happened during this pulse flow is it wasn't all about the trees and the birds and the seeds anymore. A lot of people noticed. And so pretty much as soon as the water showed up in the one big city in this region, which by the way is called San Luis Rio Colorado. So it's a city named after the river where the river doesn't flow. And in fact, they have a toll bridge that crosses the riverbed right outside of the city limits. And someone told me this summer that it's like been the biggest joke and frustration that they have to wait in lines and then pay a toll to cross over a non-existent river. But we gave them a river for a brief moment. So people turned out, and every time I drove over that bridge or stopped by down underneath where you could access the channel from the banks, there were people playing in the water. It was pretty remarkable to see. And you started to get the sense that people were taking their kids out to see a river that they had never seen before. Hey kids, there's a river here. This is what's supposed to be here. It was pretty special thing to see. And one last little bit of video to show you the sense of celebration that was really evolved over the 8 weeks that the river was flowing down there. So you can buy your fruit, you could listen to a little band, you could swim in the river, and this was completely spontaneous. Nobody arranged for this to happen. This is just the community turning out to celebrate. Eventually, towards the end of our 8-week flow experiment, we finally saw the tongue of the pulse flow, which is coming down up here in the north. And here is an arm of the tides coming up from the south. And we do have very big tides in this area. And this, I think, was, I don't know, May 14th or so. But the next day, the tides had extended up and those two bodies of water connected. I don't know if anyone here was paying attention to the media around this issue, that made a huge media splash. You can tell by looking at it, it was a very small percentage of our entire pulse flow that made it down here. It's not like it was some big freshwater inundation of the estuary, but it nonetheless seems to have resonated quite a bit with people who were paying attention to this event. So on the media coverage, we did get some big stories, sort of more in-depth coverage in Outside Magazine and High Country News, kind of usual suspects, but also hundreds of stories in English language and Spanish language newspapers. This is just what I could find in my email. This is not a comprehensive search of news stories, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what the media coverage was, and to say that some of it would have happened on its own, but I will also say that there was a deliberate effort from the NGOs, from the conservation community, to make information about this event available to the media, to try to put the spotlight on this event, because for all we know, this is our one shot at this deal. And if we want to sustain restoration efforts into the future, we need to build awareness about this region, even if we never get to do another pulse flow, and I hope we do. This was a very important component of our work. So the pulse flow, you already got the sense that, we did our best with the best our experts could tell us, but we were largely working in a situation where we had very little data and very little understanding, in fact, of how water would behave in this system. So in the minute itself, it said that we had to have, or that the United States and Mexico would mount a monitoring program to assess the hydrologic and ecological impacts of the pulse flow. And in fact, they made good on that commitment, although the minute hadn't said how much money they would put towards it. They've put upwards of $2 million into a monitoring effort that will extend over the 5 years. Clearly, the biggest set of field activities occurred during the pulse flow itself, but we continue to follow up. By no means do I have a full story for you, but very quickly, there were key questions hydrologically. How did the pulse flow magnitude change as it made its way down the channel? How did groundwater respond to the pulse flow? Was there a geomorphic response? And was there a change in channel topography? Very quickly, this is just to show you the lines of the delivery request and the delivery that was made. So you can see that Reclamation and Conagua and IBWC and SELA did a great job getting us our pulse flow as we requested it. You're not going to be able to read these dates, but it basically shows you the progression of the water moving down the channel over time. And we have gotten feedback from some of the folks using remote sensing that the inundation was successful on more than 4,000 acres. And of course, we have our confirmed connection of the pulse flow to the sea. This is an interesting graphic that is in a report, a preliminary report on the monitoring that has been released in December, that shows the remaining percentage of the pulse flow in the channel as you move downstream. And so what you're really seeing here is rapid infiltration into the groundwater. But you have to remember that water under the ground is not water that has miraculously disappeared from this system. It is in the groundwater. And so there is a whole complement to monitoring of what's happened to that groundwater, where the groundwater has gone. We will get some view, not a perfect view of that. That is still to come. Key questions on vegetation is how did the water deliveries change riparian veg composition, cover, and distribution, and how did they impact vegetation recruitment and establishment? We don't have a lot of those answers yet. That's to come in the future. But we did have some remote sensing analysis that detected a green up. So comparing the 2014 post-pulse imagery to what they saw the same period of time in 2013 was a 43% green up in the inundation zone, a 23% green up in the entire riparian area, including areas that weren't inundated, groundwater. And those results were reported first at this past year's AGU conference, and I think there will be papers forthcoming. There are key questions on wildlife. Oswald is your guy to talk about this, but essentially how did the birds respond? And that again is going to be over time. And then some questions about the estuary, which is harder to monitor, and as you get a sense, sort of less of a signal to even monitor down there. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is go from this conceptual graphic of how water might behave in this system to a more data-rich and experienced pulse flow, so that if we have the opportunity to deliver another pulse flow in the future, we have a lot more information to inform how we do it and get, over time, increasingly good results from it. So just very quickly, I'm going to wrap up with some next steps, the long view. Peter mentioned we have a campaign in the conservation community amongst the NGOs called Raise the River. We have a website. Go there. We've got lots of great videos, lots of blog posts from during the pulse flow. It is a cooperative effort of 6 NGOs in the US and Mexico, Sonoran Institute, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Environmental Defense Fund, Pro Natura, the Nature Conservancy, and the Redford Center. If you go to the website, you can see a video that was narrated by our friend Robert Redford, pretty exciting. And I just want to end pointing out that, we felt like a few lonely people back in the 90s talking about this crazy idea, but part of our special sauce and our secret to success is we've made a lot of friends and they've stuck with us. And so over time, we have mounted really a small army of institutions that are working together now, so that we've gone from neither country feeling like they knew what to do with the Delta, nor wanting to take any responsibility for it because they couldn't fix it on their own, to having really a lot of institutional support for trying to figure out how to do restoration in this area. And it has been my honor to get to work with all these folks. So thank you for listening, and I'll take questions. That's a great question.
Where did the NGOs get their water?
So the NGOs secure their water through the Colorado River Delta Water Trust that operates in the Mexicali Valley in Mexico, buying Mexican shares of Colorado River water on a market that existed before the trust showed up. There's active trade between irrigators in water. So purchases.
Purchase it from Mexican water right holders.
Correct.
That's great.
And then for the pulse flow, it was essentially cooperatively created through efforts of the United States and Mexico to line a canal in Mexico that will conserve water. That water gets stored in Mead. That hasn't happened yet. So what we did with some tricky accounting is borrow from some of the water that got banked during the earthquake to deliver the pulse flow. Critically here, because of what we call the law of the river, and Peter would be much better at explaining this to you than I, the water for the pulse flow from the U.S. essentially was U.S. contributing some money to Mexico, Mexico conserving water, and then exchanging some of that water with the United States in exchange for the financial support to build their water conservation project. And the U.S. then used most, but not all, of that exchanged water to create its contribution to the pulse flow. Mexico then also contributed to the pulse flow with their share of conserved water that they funded. I've probably confused you, but the answer is the United States and Mexico with some really tricky deals that the lawyers had to work to keep everybody happy.